Today, let us talk about the recent situation in Russia. Many people might have noticed that Russia has indeed been going through a rough patch lately, especially on the Russia-Ukraine battlefield. Although they paid a heavy price to capture the strategic city of Red Army, as long as the West continues to provide Ukraine with constant aid, Russia's hope for Ukraine to surrender is truly a distant dream. Let us first talk about the negative impacts brought by the war. Since the beginning of this year, these impacts have become increasingly apparent. They can't be hidden anymore. First, let us look at the economic aspect. After several years of war consumption, Russia's economy is indeed facing significant difficulties. Inflation has long ceased to be news. Everyone is probably tired of hearing about it. But the latest news is, Putin plans to cut defense spending in 2026. This is quite unusual. Keep in mind, the Russia-Ukraine war is still ongoing. The Russian military is far from being able to secure a decisive victory. And now, at such a critical moment, they want to cut defense spending. This clearly indicates that Russia's economy and finances are really starting to buckle. What is even more troubling is the U.S. will impose secondary tariffs on countries like China and India that continue to purchase Russian oil. This is clearly aimed at further hitting the Russian economy. Of course, China is very unlikely to respond to such threats from the U.S. But countries like India do not have the same confidence as China. In the end, they will most likely distance themselves from Russia. If that happens, Russia's upcoming economic situation will only become more perilous. Looking at the political side, the situation Russia faces is also becoming increasingly severe. Western hostility towards Russia has never lessened. Even Trump, who was previously the only one somewhat favorable to Putin, has now started to lose patience. Moreover, within the former Soviet Union, the situation is not looking good either. Azerbaijan has officially declared its defection. It has also received strong support from Turkey. At the same time, Armenia announced its withdrawal from the Russia-led CSTO. What does this mean? It means Russia has lost its traditional sphere of influence in the South Caucasus. The strategic corridor for projecting influence into the Middle East has also been cut off. The 5 Central Asian stands have gradually started to listen less to orders and more to declarations over the past 2 years. Not much under Russian control anymore. Even Mongolia recently announced it will abandon Cyrillic script and revert to traditional Mongolian script. These are all clear signs of Russia's geopolitical influence sharply declining. As for the sentiments within Russia, overall, Putin can still barely maintain control. But if there are large-scale surprise attacks within Russia, again, it could still succeed. But Russia can't stop the observers from coming. Beneath the surface of stability, there are actually turbulent undercurrents. The Putin government's control is not as solid as it appears. Overall, Russia today, although still holding some advantages on the Ukraine battlefield, outside the battlefield, whether in politics, economy, or internal and external environment, things have worsened even more than before the war started. That is also why Putin has been unable to cease fire. He even does not mind wasting Trump's goodwill. After all, when Putin launched this war, his goal was never those few states in eastern Ukraine. It is not just Ukraine either. If it were only about these, he could have acted back during the Crimea crisis in 2014. It was much easier back then than in 2022. What Putin wants is to take advantage of the overall decline of the West. Through this war, he aims to completely shatter the geopolitical shackles on Russia to achieve a strategic breakthrough for Russia. At the same time, he wants to leverage the prestige and opportunities brought by the war to establish the position of his successor, ensuring a smooth transition for Russia in the post-Putin era. But Putin only saw the decline of the West. He did not see his own country, especially how much the military has deteriorated, so the course of the war quickly diverged from his plans and control, turning into a self-destructive quagmire. Looking back, none of those grand strategic visions were realized. Instead, Russia's overall situation has worsened significantly. But precisely because of this, the war can't come to an end. The current situation is, aside from those battered eastern provinces, Russia has not gained anything. Strategic interests have been heavily sacrificed, and yet there is a ceasefire. It is just a huge mess. Putin simply can't bring the situation to a close. Not even a pause is possible. If Ukraine could agree to those conditions from Russia, Putin would have a way out and could temporarily pause for a while. But unfortunately, Zelensky either sees through Russia's weakness or fears being held accountable after a ceasefire. He absolutely refuses to agree. He insists on dragging Ukraine to fight Russia to the end. Europe has also taken over after the U.S. presidential transition, strongly supporting Ukraine. In the end, even the West's only pro-Russian figure, Trump, changed his stance. He started to shift his position on Russia. following the trend. There is no other way to put it. The Russia-Ukraine war has been ongoing for years. Judging from the current situation, in terms of military technology and equipment, the Russian army really does not have much advantage over the Western-backed Ukrainian forces. But to say there is a huge disadvantage would be an exaggeration. Overall, Russia and Ukraine are like two rookies pecking at each other, engaging in an enhanced version of a World War II-style conflict in the 21st century. Since their technology and equipment are roughly comparable, it all comes down to a contest of national strength. Of course, Russia's national strength is greater than Ukraine's, but Ukraine has Western support behind it. And Russia, as a geopolitical power, has its war resources tied up in the Middle East, South Caucasus, and other regions, so it can't fully commit to the Russia-Ukraine battlefield. So the final outcome is that, although Russia can maintain an advantage, it is difficult to turn that advantage into a decisive victory. The Russia-Ukraine war has to be regarded as a war of attrition and economic endurance. This undoubtedly goes against Putin's original intentions. But with the war reaching this point, he has no choice but to passively accept it. The West also hopes to drain Russia's economy through the battlefield, ultimately triggering an internal revolution, overthrowing Putin's rule. In this way, Putin finds himself truly in a dilemma. But does Russia really have no cards left to play? Will it really be, as some Western analysts or certain pro-Western public intellectuals at home believe, that in the end, it will run out of steam and suffer a crushing defeat? Of course not. Although internal resources have already been mobilized to the limit, if Putin really wants to keep it going, there is still one card he can play. What is the strategy? Simply put, 6 words: sell the East, save the West. Russia has always prioritized Europe over Asia. West over East. The importance of the Eastern European front far exceeds that of the Asian front, especially the Far East region. This also aligns with Russia's national conditions. After all, its core and essence are concentrated in Eastern Europe. As for the Asian part, especially the Far East, from an economic perspective, it is merely a resource supplier. Russia lacks both the financial resources and the population to develop Northern Asia. The geopolitical environment does not allow it either. However, while the Far East is essentially a colonial territory for Russia, it holds significant strategic value for China. Not to mention the direct agricultural, forestry products, and mineral resources. At the geopolitical level, strategic passages, such as ports in Russia's Far East, open up the Northeast geopolitical predicament for China and integrate Northeast Asia. Even the strategy regarding the Arctic holds great value. It can even be said that the desolate land of the Far East is controlled by Russia, a world-class geopolitical power. The desolate land of the Far East is controlled by Russia, a world-class geopolitical power. It poses a significant geopolitical threat to Northeast China itself. Although China and Russia are currently on opposite sides, Russia is now in a state of decline. This threat does not exist in the short or medium term, but in the long run, once Russia recovers. And if China-Russia relations cool down, Northeast China, Inner Mongolia, and North China could once again face the nightmare of Tsarist and Soviet domination. Since the Far East has so much strategic value for China, then for Putin, these are actually all bargaining chips. They can be used to exchange for economic resources from China. This is to support his competition with the West. Of course, what he could take, Putin has already taken. On the eve of the Russo-Ukrainian war, Putin went to Beijing and signed a bunch of agreements with the Chinese side. As the Russia-Ukraine war bogged down, later, Far East cooperation and development were also put on the bargaining table by Putin. But the problem is, this still is not enough. The not enough here does not mean it is insufficient for China, but rather it is insufficient to support the Russia-Ukraine war, because the consumption of the Russia-Ukraine war keeps exceeding Putin's expectations. This means the benefits Putin can offer from the Far East correspond to the chips he can exchange from China. It is no longer sufficient to support his expenses in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and elsewhere. This is the situation. 3 years into the war, this is the reason why Russia's economy is starting to show signs of decline. Russia's economy in recent years has largely been propped up by trade with China. Although China has supported Russia politically and economically against Western pressure, this does not mean that Russia can take it for granted. Trade between the two countries has always been a matter of getting what you pay for. How many chips Putin puts on the table determines how much he can get from China in return. As for wanting more, of course that is possible, but that would require offering more benefits in exchange. Based on this logic, since the resource demands of the Russia-Ukraine war or geopolitical games have exceeded expectations, Putin wants to stabilize the economic foundation and maintain the situation, they have to offer more benefits to China in exchange for new concessions. Of course, many would say that now, in the Far East, Russia has already given all the benefits it can. What else is there to give? But from China's perspective, since you have taken everything you can, then just take what you can't take. What are the things you can't take? The answer is what was mentioned earlier, China's long-standing interest in the Far East geopolitical region. Of course, when I talk about geopolitical interests here, I am not suggesting that Putin should directly sell the Far East to China. After all, it is already the 21st century now. No one dares to sell their territory outright, and they can't do it either. But China is not asking you to sell your land, after all. What we want are geopolitical interests, specifically that Russian-North Korean friendship bridge over the Tumen River that deliberately blocks China's access to the sea. Can we blow it up and build a new one higher up? Then the part north of the Tumen River that belongs to Russia, you have been leaving it unused anyway. Why not carve out a piece and lease it to us to build a port? Also, Vladivostok can be handled the same way, specifically develop several Chinese ports, then build a railway controlled by China to connect them. Even further away, the Chukchi Peninsula, adjacent to the Arctic and the Bering Strait, and just after the earthquake, the Kamchatka Peninsula, where underground potential energy was greatly released. Our geographic exploration team could find a suitable harbor there, then lease it along with the surrounding area as our base of operations in the Arctic and the North Pacific. Russia is so familiar with this kind of tactic. Back in the Tsarist and Soviet eras, Russia also played these kinds of games in the Northeast. The Chinese Eastern Railway, Harbin, and so on. Isn't that how it was done? Of course, times have changed. We can't behave as shamelessly as we did in the past. So there is a lot of room for negotiation. For example, the lease term does not have to be 99 years, 50 years is fine. As for the ports and railways, Russia can also have shares. Everyone can make money together, as long as control remains in China's hands. In short, the Far East is not just about agricultural, forestry, and mineral economic interests. There are also maritime economic interests and geopolitical interests. Russia has almost sold everything it can in terms of the former, but it is still not enough. As for the latter, Russia itself can't monetize it, so it is better to sell or lease it to China, which has the ability to monetize it. China will not only pay a lump sum up front, but also provide ongoing rent and profit sharing afterward. And it can also come with greater political support. With this huge influx of funds from China, Russia can not only stabilize its economy now, but also have a continuous stream of income in the future. This not only significantly eases the economic pressure of the Russia-Ukraine war, but also allows Russia to reassert its influence over the South Caucasus. Internally, it suppresses the restless Chechen and other North Caucasus warlords. Of course, seeing this, someone will surely say, isn't this just selling the Far East to China? This land of the Far East, Russia usually can't reach it. With China's economic strength and strategic position, once they bring it in the long run, won't it just repeat the story of Tsarist Russia's expansion into northeast China back in the day? Only now, China and Russia have swapped roles. How should I put it? First of all, the rules of the game in the 21st century have changed. The practice of annexing other countries' territories has been abandoned by the times. As a major power committed to peaceful rise, China is unlikely to engage in such 19th century dealings. And looking at the current environment, as long as Russia can maintain its existence, China would never attempt to seize its territory. Or do you think this has any impact? That definitely has an impact. After all, the Far East was originally very desolate. A total of 6.95 million square kilometers of land, with only a mere 6.29 million people. And Russia's influence over the Far East has always been very weak. Moreover, this weak influence has continued to diminish with Russia's decline. The population is also gradually decreasing. In this situation, once China is brought in, the Far East will, in terms of both economy and culture, be deeply integrated with China in the long run. From Russia's perspective, there are indeed many long-term risks. But the problem is, currently, Russia's economy is gradually unable to sustain Putin's long-term involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It could even trigger a chain reaction in the South Caucasus and Chechnya. In this situation, if Russia cannot secure a new strong influx of resources, I am afraid the geopolitical interests in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region will all suffer significant backlash. For a country like Russia in Eastern Europe, let alone Ukraine or Belarus, even the South Russian Caucasus region, its geopolitical interests are above those in the Far East. Moreover, the risk of damage to geopolitical interests in Eastern Europe is imminent, while the potential damage to geopolitical interests in the Far East is only a long-term potential threat, even if such a possibility truly exists. On one side is the real threat to the core area, and on the other is the long-term risk from the extreme periphery. The two are of different weights and significance. I believe Russia can still tell the difference. Of course, for a strongman president like Putin, what he seeks is to have it both ways. So even now, Russia is still in such a difficult situation, he remains stubborn and refuses to back down. Even in terms of the economy, although Russia's current economy relies entirely on China-Russia trade, the market relies entirely on Chinese goods to keep running, but Russia still occasionally harbors some ulterior motives. For example, in energy and the development of infrastructure and resources in the Far East. Recently, Russia has been having some secretive exchanges with South Korea. It is worth noting that South Korea is currently participating in sanctions against Russia. At the same time, the Chinese automotive market targeting Russia has also been repeatedly sabotaged by the Russian government. The most recent incident occurred on August 1st. The Russian customs system automatically switches to the new tax rate table. The scrapping tax for a 20-ton Chinese truck suddenly jumps from 2.62 million rubles to the scrapping tax for a domestic truck jumps from 2.62 million rubles to. Behind these small maneuvers, there is also an underlying suspicion of China from Russia. Although currently fighting Western powers to the death, Russia still has not given up the hope of reconciliation with the West. And regarding China, even though Russia's future and fate are now highly tied to cooperation with China, it still deeply fears us. While dependent, it is afraid of becoming our vassal. Of course, this is understandable. After all, Russia is also a world-class geopolitical power on the same level as us. Although this same level now only appears superficial. In reality, Russia has long been strong on the outside, but weak on the inside. But as long as the great powers maintain their posturing and ambitions, it is not unreasonable for Russia to be wary of us. However, the situation is stronger than any individual. No matter how much Russia tries to guard against China, it ultimately cannot shake off its dependence on China, and the geopolitical pattern favoring the West over the East, along with the macro trend of the West accelerating while the East slows, are things Russia cannot change. So, as long as Russia cannot win on the battlefield in Ukraine, or even end the war in Ukraine, on terms it can accept, then over time, as the funds from selling oil, gas, timber, and minerals become increasingly unable to cover the strategic expenditures for Russia, the Caucasus, and the entire Middle East, there will ultimately come a day when the geopolitical interests in the Far East will be put on the negotiating table with China by Putin, so we do not need to rush at all. The money is sitting in the central bank's account. The lease, agreements, and such are all locked in the safe. If you, Putin, have the ability, then use the resources at hand to sort everything out. If not, you are always welcome to come and talk. We guarantee fair prices, no deception. In fact, from a broader perspective, the exchange of interests between countries is the norm. The dilemma Russia faces now is the result of multiple factors acting together, and the geopolitical trade-offs in the Far East might be the relatively feasible way out it can find at the moment.